Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. I'm ready to jump in.
Great. Today, we're going back to the early days of the United States, to an election that really tested the young nation.
Yeah, the election of 1800. It was, well, let's just say it was a pretty wild ride.
Definitely. I mean, can you imagine an election so close it takes 36 rounds of voting to decide the winner?
It's almost hard to believe, right? It had everything, scandals, political maneuvering, even international intrigue. You couldn't make this stuff up.
And at the center of it all, these larger-than-life figures we call the Founding Fathers.
Right.
But, as we'll see, they were far from perfect.
Oh, yeah. They had their flaws, their ambitions, their rivalries, just like anyone else, and all those things came to a head in this election.
So let's start with one of the most infamous figures of the era, Alexander Hamilton. A brilliant mind, but also a man who couldn't seem to stay out of trouble.
Yeah, Hamilton was, well, how do I put this? He was a bit of a hot mess.
I think that's putting it mildly. I mean, the Reynolds affair, that's a scandal for the ages.
A secret affair, blackmail, a public confession. It's like something out of a daytime soap opera.
Exactly. And he even published this whole pamphlet trying to explain himself, the Reynolds pamphlet, I think it was called.
95 pages long. Imagine a politician trying to pull that off today. Social media would have a field day.
Right. It's wild. But it does show you how different things were back then. Even with this huge scandal, Hamilton was still a major player in politics.
He definitely had staying power, that's for sure. But the affair did damage his reputation and contributed to the growing divisions within his own party, the Federalists.
Okay, so let's back up a bit and set the scene. John Adams, our second president, takes office in 1797. And he inherits a country that's already pretty divided.
Yeah, it was a time of great uncertainty both at home and abroad. The French Revolution was raging in Europe, and it was having a big impact on American politics.
The U.S. was trying to stay neutral, but it was a tough balancing act. You had the Federalists, like Hamilton, who wanted closer ties with Great Britain.
And then you had the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, who were more sympathetic to the French.
So you have this ideological split that's just getting wider and wider. It's almost like we're talking about two different countries here.
And it wasn't just a polite disagreement either. The political climate was incredibly heated, with vicious attacks in the press and even physical brawls in Congress.
Yeah, this was politics at its most raw and personal. And then you have the XYZ affair, which nearly pushed the U.S. and France into an all-out war.
Right. The French were seizing American ships, demanding bribes. It was a major diplomatic crisis that really inflamed tensions.
And it led to the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were supposed to protect national security, but were really used to silence critics of the government.
Especially those pesky Democratic Republicans.
Right. And one of the most famous victims of the Sedition Act was Matthew Lyon, a congressman who was actually jailed for criticizing President Adams.
But here's the crazy part. He was reelected to Congress even while he was in prison.
So clearly, public opinion was starting to turn against the Federalists and their hardline tactics.
Yeah, the tide was definitely shifting. And all of this sets the stage for the explosive election of 1800, which we'll dive into next time.
That's right, we're just getting started. So stay tuned for part 2, where we'll really get into the thick of the political drama.
It's amazing to think about, isn't it? This whole idea of a brand new nation trying to find its footing.
Yeah, figuring out how to balance individual freedom with the need for stability and security.
Exactly. And then you have this backdrop of revolution in Europe. The French Revolution really shook things up, made people question everything.
It must have been a very unsettling time. I mean, you have the Federalists looking at France and thinking, we don't want that happening here.
Right. They saw chaos and anarchy. They wanted order, a strong central government.
And on the other side, you have the Democratic Republicans who are more idealistic, maybe a little more romantic about revolution.
Yeah, they saw the potential for positive change, for greater equality.
So as we head into the election of 1800, we've got all these tensions building. The XYZ affair, the Alien and Sedition Acts.
And this fundamental disagreement about the direction of the country.
It's a recipe for a political showdown.
And that's exactly what we got. The election pitted John Adams, the incumbent president, against his own vice president, Thomas Jefferson.
Talk about awkward. I mean, can you imagine that happening today?
It's hard to even wrap your head around it, right? And remember, this was a time before candidates campaigned for themselves.
So how do they get their message out?
It was all about newspapers, pamphlets, and partisan loyalists spreading the word.
And it got pretty nasty, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. The campaign was full of personal attacks, accusations of treason. It was brutal.
And then you have Alexander Hamilton, who just couldn't resist stirring the pot.
Right, he had this grudge against Adams and decided to publish a pamphlet attacking him.
That seems like a bad idea.
It backfired spectacularly, alienated a lot of Federalists, and probably helped Jefferson in the process.
So even with Hamilton's meddling, Adams still got a decent number of votes.
The problem was, he ended up tying with his own running mate, Aaron Burr.
Wait, so they both had the same number of electoral votes?
Yep, a tie. Can you believe it?
So how do you break a tie like that?
It went to the House of Representatives, and guess who controlled the House?
The Federalists.
You got it. Which is kind of ironic, considering they didn't want either Jefferson or Burr to be president.
Talk about a political nightmare. So what happened?
It took 36 rounds of voting, can you imagine that? But finally, Jefferson came out on top.
I bet there were a lot of sleepless nights during those 36 rounds.
Oh, I'm sure. And it's widely believed that Hamilton, despite his dislike for Jefferson, played a role in persuading some Federalists to switch their votes.
So in a way, he helped ensure a peaceful transfer of power, even if it meant his rival got the White House.
It's a fascinating twist, isn't it?
It really shows how fragile this new democracy was.
The election of 1800 was a huge test. It exposed the weaknesses of the system, but it also showed its strength.
Yeah, I mean, you have this intense partisan rivalry, people willing to do almost anything to win.
But at the end of the day, they respected the outcome. They accepted the results.
That's a pretty big deal, especially considering what was happening in other parts of the world.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that democracy is a process. It's messy, it's complicated, but it's worth fighting for.
It's amazing how even after all these years, we're still talking about Hamilton.
Right. He's had a resurgence in popularity lately.
Yeah, between the musical and just, I don't know, maybe it's the political climate, people seem to really connect with him.
I think it's because his story is so human, so full of drama and contradiction.
He was brilliant, ambitious, and flawed all at the same time.
And he made some serious mistakes, mistakes that would probably destroy a politician today.
Yeah, like the Reynolds affair. It's hard to imagine someone surviving that in the 24/7 news cycle.
It makes you wonder how we should judge historical figures, right? Do we focus solely on their accomplishments?
Or do we also have to consider their personal lives, their failings?
It's a tough question, especially when we're talking about people who lived in a very different time with different values.
I mean, some people say we shouldn't even be studying these figures anymore. We should just erase them from history.
But I think that's a mistake. We can't just pretend the past didn't happen.
Right. It's about learning from history, both the good and the bad.
Exactly. And I think Hamilton's story is a perfect example of that.
He did some amazing things, helped build the foundations of our nation.
But he also had these huge flaws that ultimately led to his downfall.
It's a reminder that even the most brilliant people are human. They make mistakes. They have weaknesses.
And their stories are all the more fascinating because of that.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the election of 1800,
What are some of the key takeaways?
I think for me, it's the reminder that democracy is fragile. It takes work. It takes compromise.
And it's not always pretty.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
There's going to be conflict. There's going to be scandal.
But we have to keep striving to make it better.
To live up to those ideals that the Founding Fathers, for all their flaws, set out for us.
It's a challenge, but it's one worth taking on.
Absolutely. So to everyone listening out there, thank you for joining us on this journey back in time.
We hope you learned something new, maybe even challenge some of your assumptions.
And we hope you'll keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep engaging with history.
It's a story that belongs to all of us.
And until next time, keep on diving.